The body of a schoolboy has been discovered in Scotland.
This is probably one of the most difficult scenes to examine. It can be incredibly emotional, but as a CSI, you've got a job to do.
Detectives believe he'd been abducted.
I imagine how long that journey would have felt if you thought at any moment you were going to die.
An international manhunt is launched.
One of the most demanding murder investigations Scotland's ever seen.
The forensic team must act fast to find evidence of the killer at the crime scene.
No matter how careful offenders think they've been, we will always find a trace at a crime scene.
The body of a young boy has been discovered on an isolated pathway in the early hours of the morning. He has suffered multiple stab wounds and his clothes have been burned from his body. The entire area is cordoned off and Senior Investigating Officer Elliot Mackenzie is called to the scene.
When I got down here, there was a young boy. His body was lying almost exactly where the bench that you see there is. He'd suffered considerable burns.
I don't think there's a word approaches describing how I felt.
The murder of a child can be one of the most horrendous crimes known. Can be potentially quite an emotional experience for the CSIs investigating them, particularly if they've got children of their own. Can be very disturbing.
The previous afternoon, a boy was reported to have been violently abducted in broad daylight from the other side of the city.
We put people around about, stopped people in the streets who were trying to find out what happened to the young boy.
An operation involving 40 officers is underway after a crime to horrify even this city.
The missing child was named as 15-year-old Chris Donald.
A totally innocent boy, 15 years of age. No previous background of trouble. I can't imagine what Chris was going through at that point in time. It's unimaginable, unimaginable.
A brazen abduction in broad daylight of a young boy, a 15-year-old. A particularly brutal murder. It's horrible.
A team of officers investigate who abducted Chris Donald, whilst Elliot and his team begin to search the crime scene for any forensic evidence.
You have to remember that you're not there as a family member or a relative, you're there as a professional to almost try and detach yourself from the emotional side. You've got a job to do.
Crime scene expert Sarah Thurkel has over 25 years' experience in the field.
Where the body was found was an outdoor scene, and this is probably one of the most difficult scenes to examine. It was on a public footpath next to a river, so it needs to be protected from the elements, it needs to be protected from members of the public. We really are working against the clock to recover as much forensic evidence as you can in case anything's lost.
In order to develop a forensic strategy, the investigation need to ascertain what happened at the scene.
Do we think that this body was killed here or killed elsewhere and then dumped here? Because that makes a difference into our investigative command.
A body that's been injured so badly and also burnt is incredibly fragile. A pathologist is called to examine the body in situ. This is to try and process any trace evidence on the victim as soon as possible. And they would take swabs from skin surfaces or any swabs from injuries that they could see whilst trying not to disturb the body any further.
The CSIs begin their search at the body and fan out across the scene.
Found some blood staining in the grass. Followed that staining up. Bits of blood which could easily be traced back to this area here where the undergrowth's up, where there were 20 to 30 logs, maybe 10 feet in length, here piled up. There was evidence of charring and a strong smell of accelerant. The charring would indicate this young person sat down on those logs and possibly accelerant poured over him and set alight.
At the crime scene, there was a range of forensic evidence. Firstly, there was clear evidence that a burning had taken place in the logs, which the scientists who attended interpreted as being a site of attack. But the body wasn't found there. The body was found some short distance away. The obvious inference in putting this together is that the victim had moved to where his body was found and he had died there.
He had possibly ran maybe towards the river, but had found water there. And it looked to me that perhaps he lay down in that puddle and was trying to put the fire out. And that's really the position that we found him in. Clothes had more or less melted, and he was lying in a kind of fetal position.
Clyde Walkway is declared the scene of the murder. Chris's body is sent for a post-mortem examination, while detectives look for investigative leads.
The normal strategies would be house to house, let's get some witnesses. And clearly, in a place like that, there were no witnesses. No lighting, there's no CCTV. So what was in front of us was all we were going to get from that scene. And it was key that we did that meticulously.
Obviously, at the time of any investigation, you're not sure what evidence is relevant and what isn't relevant. So it's our objective to take as much forensic evidence from that scene because we don't know what may be important later on in the investigation.
Also found at the crime scene were some tyre tracks. It was obviously important they were sampled speedily because, again, if the weather comes in and changes them, then evidence might be lost.
It's possible to ascertain what vehicle has made that tyre track mark because you could measure the distance between the tyres and therefore measure the potential size of the chassis of the vehicle and work out what actual vehicles made the tyre track marks at a crime scene. They will cast them with casting material, which is a little bit like plaster of Paris. So the casting material is mixed up at the scene and then it's poured very carefully into the tyre track. This actually takes an impression of the tyre track mark, which can then be examined by a forensic scientist.
Tyre marks are a bit like shoe marks. Although they're mass-produced and they're in standard patterns, they also wear and change as they are used. And many view this combination of original pattern and pattern of wear as unique characteristics.
The CSIs continue the forensic harvest, and the results are in from the post-mortem examination.
The samples that were taken from the body at the side of the river revealed no trace evidence and no DNA. This is probably because that evidence has been destroyed by the fire. A pathologist is able to ascertain if someone's been alive while they've been burning. Then there'd be soot in the lungs and also in the air passages going down to the lungs. In this case, the young boy was alive when he was set on fire. It's quite disturbing that human beings could actually do that to somebody. It beggars belief that there are individuals that can do that to people.
The post-mortem revealed that he had suffered 13 stab wounds, 7 to the chest and abdomen, and 5 to the back, and I think 1 through the arm. But 2 of those stab wounds would have been fatal. Had he survived the fire, he still have probably had no chance whatsoever. It's unimaginable. According to the pathologist, there was a total lack of defence wounds, which troubled me greatly.
Defence injuries are where someone's tried to defend themselves, so if they know they're going to be attacked, they'll put their arms up or their hands up, and quite often you'll find defence injuries on their wrists or on the side of their hands. If there are no defence injuries, they've been restrained by a second individual or third individual, so they've not been able to defend themselves.
The report implies there may be multiple suspects, and with just a tyre track cast recovered from the crime scene, the detectives are hoping the abduction site may provide some new leads.
I saw my responsibility in being dedicated and leave no stone unturned to resolve this.
On the 15th of March 2004, schoolboy Chris Donald was abducted. His body was later discovered on an isolated walkway on the other side of the city.
The terrified teenager bringing him here to this deserted pathway to the east of the city. They then stabbed and set him alight whilst he was still alive.
The CSIs managed to recover a tyre track impression from the crime scene, but with a lack of witnesses and CCTV, the detectives hope to get some fresh leads from the scene of the abduction.
An abduction of that type is unlikely to yield very much because it's a very quick event. The key focus would be who else had witnessed this, had anyone else seen it. A friend of the victim, Jamie Wallace, who saw a car containing 5 Asian men pulled up beside him and his friend.
Jamie Wallace was left standing in Kenmure Street, concerned the men who took his friend would come back for him.
They were saying, do you know what pain is? You're next. They were saying I was next.
A very traumatic incident of an abduction in broad daylight of a young boy. Had been grabbed in the street, punched, kicked, leaving poor Chris clinging to the railings of the bowling green, screaming, I'm 15 years old, what have I done? Why me? That's appalling.
In this working class and strongly Asian quarter of Glasgow, which has seen more than its share of gang and drug-related violence.
When the abduction happened, the shops nearby all slammed their shutters and wanted nothing to do with it. All of a sudden, CCTV wasn't working in that area. To say we were met with a blanket of uncooperation was probably an understatement.
In the early 2000s, Glasgow was considered the murder capital of Europe.
Glasgow in 2004 hit a peak. There were 3 times more murders in Glasgow than there were in London. And that was generally due to organised criminal gangs. So their feuds then became from the violent attacks, the brutal beatings, stabbings to shootings.
Where you have gangs and organised crime, each crime is related to some other crime. Drug supplies is related to drugs importation, and you get turf wars over drugs. I mean, violence is a way of life to them. It's an occupational hazard. They're running rackets, they are threatening people and attacking people and injuring them. So it means that things can happen and they can rely on the fact that no one will come forward to identify them or be witnesses.
With the lack of witnesses willing to speak on record, the detectives must work with the information they have to try and identify any suspects.
At this stage of the inquiry, we have 2 separate crime scenes. We have the deposition site, so where some tyre track marks. And then we also have the abduction site, where there's been a sighting of a silver vehicle. So it's really the silver vehicle that potentially is going to tie these 2 scenes together.
Vehicles are generally registered, so you can quite quickly find out who owns this vehicle. They can put out bulletins to watch out for particular vehicles, which means it's an important line of inquiry in the case.
By checking recent reports, the police have identified a silver car stolen 3 months ago. They lean on a notorious car thief for information that may help them identify a suspect.
My team went to prison and spoke to an individual who admitted stealing the car. So we now knew that we were looking for this Mercedes car.
The convicted car thief tells detectives that he sold the Mercedes to a well-known gang leader from the south side of Glasgow, called Imran Shahid.
He's a 27-year-old man, a bodybuilder. He abused steroids, which added to his mood swings and his propensity to violence. A powerful figure who saw himself as a godfather of the gang.
And another broader line of inquiry will be, who is Imran Shahid associated with? Because that's who the other 4 men are likely to be. So they want to know their identities and then take the case from there.
The team steps up its search for Imran Shahid and the silver Mercedes. And several 999 calls come in that could be linked to Chris's murder.
Monday 15th of March 2004, 8:10 at night, a number of 999 calls were received about a Mercedes motor car, silver in colour, ablaze. My forensic team arrived. We were faced with a burnt-out car.
CSIs will quite often spend a long time examining a burnt-out vehicle. It's quite difficult for us to retrieve any forensic evidence because it's been doused in water.
Despite the car having been ablaze, the CSIs may have a potential lead.
The tyres had survived, which is an excellent piece of evidence. This was then recovered and sent off for further forensic examination.
The forensics continue to examine the burnt-out car, whilst Elliot receives a call from the Organised Crime Intelligence Unit.
Some very experienced detectives came from the south side of Glasgow and gave us the full intelligence picture on the Asian gangs and their likely candidates.
They have identified Imran Shahid's 4 criminal associates. Imran's younger brother, 25-year-old Jishan Shahid, also known as Crazy. Mohammed Faisal Mushtaq, who is known as Beck. Danish Zahid, and also Zahid Mohammed, known as Ziggy, who was on early release from prison and wearing a security tag.
We believe these were the 5 individuals involved, which is great, but they then have to build the case against them. The 5 individuals I'm talking about here are part of a gang, an organised criminal gang.
Gangs often serve as a pseudo-family and work in a hierarchical system with a gang leader in place. If a gang member has the intention to harm somebody else, then it's likely that other group members may follow and take part in the commission of the act of crime.
What was unusual about this case was it wasn't clear why this gang of men abducted a 15-year-old white boy.
Because he just kept himself to himself, not involved in the gang culture, just a totally innocent boy with, I think, a big heart. He was a keen football player and had aspirations, but never got the chance to fulfil that.
Whilst the police search for the 5 suspects, the intelligence unit have news of a recent altercation outside a nightclub between Imran's gang and another rival gang.
We believe a bottle had been thrown, which perhaps hit Imran Shahid. He tried to chase them, to grab one of them, and they got away and they were taunting him. That could negatively impact on his criminal street credibility.
Gang rivalry often involves a continual cycle of retaliated violence, and in this case, it's saving the reputation that appeared to be of paramount importance, regardless of the way in which it was carried out. It may be that he needed to act fast to show to the community and the gangs that he could assert his power.
He spent the whole night articulating his rage and planning his revenge to re-establish his street credibility. And that is the sole motivation. And to go and look for their ideal target. But this was a 15-year-old boy, not some other gangster who had been involved in criminality all his day. And Chris just happened to be walking with Jamie. And that's how he was targeted. He wasn't targeted, he was just there. You've heard the expression many times, wrong place, wrong time. That sums up poor Chris's demise.
The detectives now have a motive for the murder. As Elliot's team prepares to simultaneously arrest the 5 suspects, there is some positive news from the forensics lab.
On this occasion, one of the tyres on the vehicle did match the tyre cast that was taken from the crime scene. So a forensic scientist was able to say that that tyre had made that mark at the crime scene.
The police have linked the vehicle to the murder scene, and despite it being set on fire, the scientists have managed to salvage some crucial evidence.
When the car was examined, crime scene investigators were able to find blood spots across the bonnet of the vehicle, which hadn't been destroyed by the fire. It appeared to be arterial blood. It looked like it may well have been from a knife wound because of the spatter and distribution on the bonnet of the vehicle. This would indicate that someone has been stabbed very close to the front of that vehicle. as it was possible to be able to examine this blood and swab it and try and get a DNA profile from the blood.
The blood is a match to Chris Donald.
This blood splatter went right across the bonnet of the car, or at the side of the car. So if you remember, 2 of the wounds were fatal. That could have been where those fatal wounds were applied.
The scientists continue to process the car in a bid to find trace evidence of the suspects.
Although someone's burnt a vehicle out, once you start moving items around within the vehicle, then sometimes you will find evidence under the surface. It's almost like a layer of protection. There was some melted green plastic on the back seat of the car, and this looked like it was probably a petrol can. Inside the boot of the car there was a leather jacket which was quite badly burnt. This was then recovered and sent off for further forensic examination.
To add to the urgency, far-right political groups are using the murder as propaganda.
I knew there was something odd about it and something distinctive about it. I remember it being talked about as racially motivated, which of course was very unusual.
They were shouting, white bastards. That's what the Asians were shouting. They were saying, do you know what pain is?
Trust me, there was a bad feeling in that part of Glasgow, and it could have got very violent, very violent. So it was challenging for me as an individual, it was challenging as a force to respond to this. And something had to be done, quite frankly, to ease that pressure.
As the pressure mounts, there's another forensic discovery that could be crucial to the entire case.
Inside of the boot of the vehicle there was a leather jacket. Despite the fact it was burnt, there was an area that was protected inside the jacket because it was folded over. When a forensic scientist is looking at an item for wearer's DNA, they would concentrate their examination around the neck area and around the cuffs and maybe on the inside of the pockets. You get quite a lot of skin cells that are deposited inside jacket pockets. So it was possible to be able to obtain wearer's DNA from this jacket, so they're able to link a jacket back to an individual.
By its nature, leather is extremely fire resistant. And despite the jacket being left inside the burning car, scientists have a positive DNA match.
They found DNA matching Imran Shahid. So what this evidence does is it links together the prime suspect, Imran Shahid, who has left his jacket in the car that is known to have abducted Chris Donald. It is very powerful, mutually corroborating evidence that would be very compelling if put before a jury in court.
When we were told, we were almost in disbelief, and then when it sank in, we were jubilant. That's all I'm going to say. After hundreds or thousands of gallons of water being poured on this vehicle to extinguish it by the fire service, how the DNA survived, we don't know.
They've got a very strong link, so the police then can go public to try and trace Shahid as, at the very least, a witness, if not a suspect in this crime.
This breakthrough is key to the investigation. The police can now link Imran Shahid to the crime scene. They're still looking to link Jishan Shahid, Mohammed Faisal Mushtaq, Danish Zahid and Zahid Mohammed to the murder of Chris Donald. For Elliot, the case was rapidly becoming the most complex of his career.
I knew it was going to be a big challenge. I think that's probably, it was a realisation that this was just the beginning of a massive challenge.
In Glasgow, 15-year-old Chris Donald was abducted in broad daylight before being murdered. The police have identified 5 suspects, and the forensics have linked the gang leader, Imran Shahid, to the car used for the crime.
This was the crucial link that linked an offender to the jacket, to the vehicle, and therefore that vehicle to the 2 scenes. But it's important to remain focused because they would then need to build on this to find further evidence.
Imran Shahid and the other men have yet to be located. Detectives are still working to find evidence that links the 4 other suspects: Jishan Shahid, Mohammed Faisal Mushtaq, Danish Zahid and Zahid Mohammed.
The term forensic evidence covers a multitude of different disciplines. A lot of people just think it's fingerprints and DNA, but also there's digital forensics. Digital forensics is becoming a lot more important in more recent years because everybody leaves a digital footprint somewhere.
When you switch on a mobile phone, it logs on to the nearest base station antenna, usually called a cell site. There are cell sites, base stations all around the country. If you move with a phone, if you travel with a phone, you move from one base station to another. So you can track mobile phones if they're travelling. That cell site registers the phone's metadata. So the phone number, transactions between that phone and any other phone, and it records the number of the phone that is called. So what you can achieve using this kind of evidence is that you can establish where someone is at a particular time and perhaps where they went next. Because every time the phone logs on to the cell site, the time is registered. So it's a very powerful tool for monitoring the movements of individuals, but also linking people together.
The digital forensic team have managed to track the phone data of all 5 suspects.
Their phone usage and their lack of phone usage in particular told the story. It painted the picture. Looking at the actual connectivity, there was hundreds of calls, busy calls, texts, and the significance was nobody was calling or texting at the time of the abduction.
The data shows all 5 phones travelling from Glasgow to Strathclyde Park, where just after 3:30, one phone leaves the pack. The other 4 phones continue travelling all the way to Dundee.
Chris remained in the car. We're unsure in what position, but more than likely in between them and the seat well, in the rear. There may have been some tentative stab wounds, scratches and things like that, where they were probably trying to psychologically torture Chris.
I imagine how long that journey would have felt if you thought at any moment you were going to die, which is probably what he was told and probably what he believed. So effectively, the drive to Dundee, he was being psychologically tortured throughout that period. He was in the executioner's waiting room, and that's how it was going to end. What he didn't know was just how horribly it was going to end.
The telephone data reveals disturbing details of what the gang wanted to do to Chris.
During the journey, they had made a number of calls to criminal associates. We were able to take statements which said, oh yes, Imran Shahid phoned me. He had a young boy he wanted to take somewhere. They wanted to seriously assault. And that journey took over 5 hours, up to Dundee and back with one stop, where we assume they bought the petrol which they used in the murder.
Having failed to find a location where they could torture their victim, the data shows the 4 men's phones travelling back down to Glasgow.
So it was about the key moments, which were the abduction, the journey and the murder site, and then the burning of the car. The most significant one was around about 7:20 p.m, where there's a 20-minute silence in calls. And that silence, we believe, was indicative of the fact that for those 20 to 30 minutes, they were killing Chris. In that timeline, that was the killing zone.
It was kind of, it's the level of spite and hate involved, it's the determination, you know, but you can imagine somebody abducting. I'm going to settle a score, we drive in, get him in the car, beat him up, drive around for half an hour and think, I'll beat him up, chuck him out of the car. Do you know what I mean? But no, there's so much determination here that they are willing to drive all the way to Dundee and not find somewhere, drive all the way back. They're still full of spite and hate. And they want him to suffer. It's quite a difficult crime to think about if you think about the detail.
By travelling over 200 miles to Dundee and back, the offenders have plenty of time to discuss and plan the attack. This removes the idea that this may have been an adrenaline-fuelled, spur-of-the-moment crime of passion, but rather that there was a considerable amount of time for them to think about what they were about to do.
Having built up an incriminating timeline, detectives set off to simultaneously arrest the 5 suspects.
They were all equally guilty. All of them had committed a barbaric crime. We wanted them all at the one time, and we didn't want to go down the line early doors of arresting 2 and not getting 3. And as we went to search for them, we obviously tried every known address of their criminal associates, recovered a whole host of other things and disrupted a whole host of other crimes. We recovered quantities of drugs, firearms, all sorts, with people jumping out of windows, running away with bags of drugs. It was a real, we disrupted the hornet's nest.
News of the raids spreads across Glasgow.
From community intelligence, we found out that Imran Shahidi's brother and Bex were not in that area. But we continued to search.
After a huge coordinated effort, police could only detect 2 of their suspects.
It's a calculated risk, but there came a point where we had to go for Danish and for his pal Ziggy.
With 2 in custody, police continue to search for the 3 outstanding suspects.
We'd run the course of looking for them locally, and there came a time where, we assured that they were gone by this time to make good their escape from the UK. Obviously devastated, absolutely devastated.
When a suspect or someone who's a person of significance in a crime is being traced and flees the country, with some countries there is an extradition process by which the police can apply to have that person detained and then brought back to, in this case, Scotland, to be interviewed and possibly tried. Not every country would have an extradition agreement.
I knew of people who were anti-Spain and, through time and effort, you can get them back. I just hoped that they weren't in a place where I couldn't access them.
The detectives turn their attention to the suspect's international connections.
When a suspect is being traced and flees the country, there will be intelligence work getting carried out in the background. Who are the people that might be connected with these guys?
The first person we got information on, Faisal Mushtaq, had fled the country. We got brilliant CCTV footage of him arriving at Manchester Airport. The other 2, we believe one got the Eurotunnel to Paris and one took the ferry, and they had a relative in Paris who arranged for them to get to Pakistan.
The 3 outstanding suspects have successfully fled the country. But for Danish Zahid and Zahid Mohammed, the trial begins, 9 months after the murder of Chris Donald.
So they go to trial and they just blame the other 3, who by this time are in another country.
The prosecution has a strong forensic case against both Danish Zahid and Zahid Mohammed. Their digital footprints show all 5 suspects together from before 3 p.m. on the afternoon of the abduction. But then at Strathclyde Park, Zahid's phone separates from the pack. He had to return home to adhere to a security tag curfew.
And he had to be in the house, I believe, by 7 o'clock. And if he didn't, then that would set off alarms. And the defence could prove he wasn't there when the murder was committed.
Zahid Mohammed admitted abducting Chris Donald. He was in the car on the night that they set out to find and kill a white boy.
The evidence against Danish Zahid is heard.
Danish tried to say that when the murder was taking place, he was sitting in the car and he saw nothing. He just saw a big flash of flame and he didn't get out of the car.
Danish admitted he was in the passenger seat, and forensic evidence implies that the fatal wounds to Chris happened within his eye line, indicating that Danish was privy to the crime. The jury found Danish Zahid guilty of racially motivated murder. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison.
It is in Scottish legal history now that it was the first conviction for a racially motivated murder. I remember being congratulated by a member of the media. I refused their congratulations because that was the job just half done, because the other three were flaunting Scottish justice.
In order to get justice for Chris Donald's family, Elliot would have to rewrite Scottish history and extradite the 3 remaining suspects from Pakistan.
I started this massive dynamic intelligence operation trying to work out where they were in a country of in excess of 165 million people. We were looking for 3. One of the most demanding murder investigations Scotland's ever seen.
Strathclyde police are investigating the murder of Chris Donald. He was abducted by 5 Asian men in a gangland retaliation. 2 men have been convicted for their involvement, but 3 suspects have fled to Pakistan.
If there is no extradition agreement in place in a country, you are relying on diplomacy, convincing politicians in the other country that it is in their interests for this person to be essentially forcibly extradited.
We had applied to Pakistan. We had a big meeting with Interpol, the head of intelligence, the head of investigations, outlined what evidence we had and why it was so important to get these 3 individuals back from Pakistan to face UK and Scottish justice, and convince them that we could help them to find 3 people in a country of 165 million. It was the first time it was agreed then Scotland was going to crack on with this. What was going to be key to this inquiry was going to be mobile telephones.
The suspects are using new phones in Pakistan, so the police turned to the men's associates in Scotland to help establish their digital footprints.
One of the things we were doing in Scotland was obviously opening up avenues in terms of people who were willing to speak to us, on the record or off the record, what they tell us, and to evidence that.
Either no may be seen as a breach of the loyalty. Career criminals did give evidence to assist the police authorities, and that may have been because of the gravity and the severity of the violence. The characteristics of the victim, being a young, small schoolboy, may have also encouraged people to want to give evidence, since it was against the code of the gangs.
And I remember one of the witnesses telling me that he couldn't live with himself because what they did to that boy stepped out of their code, way out of their code. And with the cooperation of the people who'd received the calls, we gave the vital evidence of the timeline that we needed.
The more communications that the police can verify with the suspect's associates, the closer they're getting to locating them.
They did eventually trace them. I was told there was a remote village in the Punjab. 1 or 2 were there, and we confirmed it was Imran Shahid, ringleader. We'd been warned that there was a chance that they might escape, and that came from Pakistani authorities. They had found out he was going to a meeting somewhere, and it was then a case of biding our time and waiting to see what was going to happen.
A landmark day for Scottish police. Pakistani authorities have arrested the 3 remaining suspects in the murder of Chris Donald.
Delighted, I have to say. There was a realisation that a mammoth task still lay in front of us. Not all went to plan. It was quite stressful.
There was a complicated extradition process, and trying to convince them you know, in what might be a politically difficult situation, that this merits the effectively enforced extradition.
3 months after the arrest, Strathclyde Police finally received the monumental confirmation.
Eventually, the extradition was granted. The words were something like, "We feel we should surrender these people to the UK and hand them over to the representative of the Scottish Police," which was myself. And it was very tense at the airport, bringing them out as well. The exchange of prisoners and the exchange of some of the evidence that was there.
The long-awaited trial finally begins at the High Court in Edinburgh.
That was the first time I was allowed myself into the court, was to see the sentences, and I was staring at the jury looking for some form of connection, and I just couldn't get it. And I have to say I was as nervous as I've ever been in my life, because for me, one not proven out of those 3 would have been disaster.
The case is heard, and the jury has reached a verdict.
Guilty and jailed for 25 years, Imran Shahid, a sadistic thug and bully, defiant to the end. He was the ringleader who sought out a white victim to attack, the man who chose Chris Donald. Guilty too, his brother Zishan, his arrogance undiminished by a 23-year sentence, to the end laughing in the face of his victim's family, who watched from above. And for their accomplice Faisal Mustaq, 22 years, his violent nature on display still to the baying crowd.
Chris's mother and his sister wept in the gallery as the jury delivered its 3 guilty verdicts.
Got very emotional. It was just time to reflect. But that job was done. Definitely no feeling of elation, just justice has been done. And a very warm glow that it had been done.
We would like to offer our sincere appreciation for the dedication that has been shown by Detective Superintendent Ellie Mackenzie and all of the officers who worked on the inquiry into the hellish murder of my son Chris. Justice has been done. Thank you. It is over.
Some cases stick in the memory. Any professional, any forensic scientist will have a small number of cases that they will have very powerful memories about. And it was over 2.5 years before the 5 men were ultimately convicted of 4 of them of murder and 1 of racially motivated abduction. In terms of the kind of murders that goes on in Scotland, this is it's a canonical offence. It's an offence that will always have some place in the history of murder in Scotland.
That there is no greater responsibility given to man than to investigate the murder of another human being. We're still talking about Chris 17 years later. We're approaching the 20th year anniversary of Chris's death. It has to be something really powerful, really, really powerful for that to happen.
Referred to as Monster Mansion due to the residents who call her home, we're taking you to Wakefield, inside the Supermax. Watch now on My5. Mental health issues make the work of the cops extra complicated. Next, as we go inside the force 24/7.